Welcome. I'm James Calicut, Waterfowl and Upland Game Bird Extension Specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Game Bird University. Well, welcome, fellas. This ought to be a really fun episode. We've been talking about this for a little while because as wildlife biologists, we always get lots of questions and lots of things floating around. It would fall into the myths, misconceptions, and kind of red herrings categories there. And no one game bird individual is short on those or reigns king. They all have their fair share of them, and some of them with some little bit of truth to them, and some of them fairly far-fetched. But I thought it'd be fun to have a conversation about some of those, some of the ones that stick out in our heads as the things that we hear all the time and work through with hunters or landowners or land managers. So we'll kind of pull back the curtain on some of these and talk through them. And so try to shed what light we can on some of them. Some of them we may not even can't really disprove, but we can talk about what we do know from science and from field experiences and whatnot. So we can kind of dispel some of these myths, and hopefully we won't ruffle too many feathers of folks out there with what we respond to. But anyway, I've been thinking about some folks to join us. I want to get another duck person beside myself on here, so I've asked Josh Stafford. Thanks, Mark. He's the Assistant Co-op Unit Leader at South Dakota State University. He's also an alumni from Mississippi State here. He did his PhD work here, and he's worked since leaving MSU. He's worked in the Illinois River Valley and other places studying waterfowl, amongst other things. And so he can kind of give us a little bit of that northern perspective on some of these myths and misconceptions. And then we also, on the game bird side, because we definitely needed a second upland person besides Mark, we've got the one and only Dave Godwin. Former turkey program coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. I guess small game and turkey program, so quail and turkeys and squirrels and everything in between. And Dave is now the Landowner Coordinator, correct, for the Mississippi Forestry Association. Dave's had a very, very long career and one of the sharpest biologists I know, and certainly the strongest wit of anybody that I know. So thought Dave would really have lots of colorful ways of talking through some of these as well. So I know this will be enjoyable. And of course, Mark is here too. So
thank you for that.
Godwin, we'll let you start off since it is turkey season. Yeah. Let's start with you. Figured you might have some good ones from the turkey side of things to start us off with, and then we'll just kind of rotate through some of them.
Well, we'll just, I guess, a couple of things anyway. There's some of these there's some overlap, Mark, with turkey and bobwhites. Some of the same kinds of myths or misconceptions. I think really there's probably more of them on the bobwhite side because the declines there are more striking, and people have all the theories as to why those declines have occurred or whatever. But one of the things on the turkey side that ties back to bobwhites and other game birds is that we often hear that wild turkeys depredate on other game birds to the scale that it causes these declines. We have fewer bobwhites because wild turkeys eat all the little bobwhites. And so, that's, as a turkey hunter, sometimes you get stuck in that thing of, well, maybe I don't want to, disprove that anyway. Let me help you with that. Let me come out to the property and try to get rid of some of these nefarious wild turkeys. But that one, we hear that a lot in Mississippi, turkeys eating bobwhites. But really, it's kind of range-wide for wild turkeys. They also eat ruffed grouse in big numbers and other game birds anyway as well. And, the reality is they are opportunistic, and they'll eat just about anything that won't eat them. I have seen in turkey crops snakes, anoles, lizards, snails, frogs. So would a wild turkey eat a small bobwhite chick? Well, probably if the opportunity presented itself. But in all the hundreds of food habit studies, that's been done on wild turkeys, I don't know of a single instance where another game bird has shown up in a crop, and most certainly not at the scale where it would be a driver. It's really that classic cause and effect issue, right? It's turkey populations across a lot of the range have increased at the same time that some of the other game bird species were on the decline, and so there's your cause and effect. And so that's one just to kind of kick it off anyway that I've heard for at least 25 years. And it's interesting to me because it's somewhat universal. Irregardless of the context, you get that across the range of the wild turkey, that the dang things are just eating up everything else, and anything that's in decline, they have a tendency to get blamed for anyway. So we'll start with
Dave,
that.
I'm glad that you picked this topic because, as I was just mentioning before we started here, eastern wild turkey populations in the eastern part of South Dakota have really increased here of late. And I just met somebody the other day, a landowner, and he was talking about these, I guess I can't use this colorful language, but stinking turkeys. He was not a fan, primarily because they were really hard on the pheasants and eating all the pheasant chicks primarily. And like you say, I mean, I'm like, a really small one, I guess, is possible, but I think you're barking up the wrong tree here.
Yeah, it's definitely a cause and effect issue, but it's pretty universal. You hear it across everywhere you have wild turkeys and have any bird species in decline, you're going to hear that one.
It's amazing.
So I love this one, Dave. And I was writing an article for a magazine a few years back, and I was like, you know what? I want to track this down. So I spent way too much time trying to figure out where this story originated. And the best I could come up with was somewhere in Florida. It was in a turkey blind, and they witnessed it doing some kind of study, and they wrote it. I think it was Florida Wildlife Magazine or some kind of generic magazine in the state of Florida, and they published that story. And that was like 70s sometime is when that hit. And like you said, the timing, the bobwhite decline was already in full swing at that point, but that was a few years after the breeding bird survey came out, and we started actually documenting that steep decline. It was crazy steep back then, so it was like the perfect storm of events. And you had turkeys starting to be restocked everywhere, and all that was getting, the awareness on turkeys was going. So everyone was like, oh, there's a lot more turkeys, there's a lot less quail. I just heard quail are in decline. Certainly, this is the thing. I had a guy in Oklahoma talking about range wide. I had a guy in Oklahoma like 5 years ago get me on the phone and tell me the same thing. I started getting some quail, and then because he started doing some management, and then I started noticing more turkeys, and my quail numbers haven't gone up, and he was just convinced that was it. And so, like you said, I mean, anything will eat a quail chick. I mean, hell, bullfrogs, deer, anything. Yeah, the scale issue is the thing. So I wouldn't put it past any animal when presented with a bobwhite chick in front of it to not eat it.
Yes.
So, yeah, that one cracks me up, and it's still going strong. Maybe not as strong as it was 20 years ago, but that rumor has not dissipated completely yet.
No, absolutely. So I got a bunch of them, but I think I'll throw one more out, and then we'll maybe switch to Bob White's for a while and then come back, circle back around a little later. But one that I hear a lot, and I have heard over the years a lot, is that wild turkeys are so innately stupid that they're going to drown in heavy rains, right? And the nature of it is they stand out in the heavy rain and put their head up and open their mouth and just damn drown.
Great evolutionary strategy.
Yeah, it really is. But now, what you do see is that wet springs are not particularly good for wild turkey reproduction, right? And so there's a couple of things there. Number one, just flat out flooding. In our part of the world, in the spring of the year, you get, of course, these big spring systems, and it's not uncommon for the Big Black River to get out, the Pearl River to get out. And so when a lot of these drainages in our part of Mississippi get out and flood, some fair bit of, nesting habitat can be taken in with that, especially in the severe flood situations. And so there's some direct loss of nests. Turkeys in general have a tendency to get up out of those drainages and nest in, more upland and intergrade between bottomlands and uplands in our part of the world. But there is some direct loss in flooding. And then there's the kind of the wet hen theory that in these years, right during the core time when they're on the nest for 28 days and they're breed rearing flightless chicks for another couple of weeks, if you have just inundating rains in that period right there, you tend to see higher mortality on nests and higher mortality on those young broods. And the theory is they're just easier for predators to locate because of the olfactory nature of being wet. But anyway, regardless, there is some pretty good tie to these deluge rain events at the wrong time in the spring, and I think that may be partly the driver behind that one anyway, but you get that one an awful lot.
It's funny you say that. Just today on Instagram alone, I have seen 2 videos from 2 separate posters of turkeys walking around in floodwater and just walking around, big toms, just doing their thing. definitely not lying belly up with their feet up because they couldn't handle a little bit of water. Dave, if you remember a few years ago, I guess maybe it's more than that, when they opened the Bonacary Spillway in Louisiana, or one of the spillways. I can't remember which one it was. Tamerlan still had some turkeys on air at Sherburne Wildlife Management Area, and they had GPS units on them, and so it all got flooded. And those birds, if I remember correctly, there's only a handful of them, but they stayed in the treetops for a pretty good while. And then eventually, I think some of them probably got eaten by owls or whatever, and then some of them maybe made it to the levee. But they lasted a pretty good while just in the treetops with several feet of water. And that was simulating, I guess, what would be a catastrophic flood.
Right.
Yeah, I think turkeys can handle a little bit of rainfall. Oh, that cracks me up.
Yeah, you definitely hear that one a lot. Like I said, I got several others, but we want to do a Bob White one or two, and then
Well, let's let the duck boys get their share before we dominate the conversation.
Okay.
With a superior species, we don't want to make them feel bad.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Well, just let's start out with I would have thought by now we would have gotten to the point where we would have thoroughly covered this one with everybody, and I'd quit getting this call, or hear this commented when I'm talking to landowners or hunters. But Ducks Unlimited is heating ponds to keep ducks from migrating. There's a lot to talk about there, from the benefit of doing that to the scale and the infrastructure required to actually do that.
Yeah, just like in the upland world, there's countless misconceptions, myths, some really old. The one I think you hear most often really doesn't do a lot of harm, but it's the classic, the northern birds are here because the mallards have red legs, which is, purely a hormonal change. You can keep a mallard in South Dakota all year round and it'll get red legs about the same time of year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's little things like that perpetuate. I think my dad told me that turkeys are so stupid they'll drown in a rainstorm.
Yeah.
So, but when it comes to, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I definitely grew up having my uncles tell me when we'd shoot a mallard that had bright orange legs, they're like, oh, this one just moved in from the north, or,
yeah.
Wasn't until years later that I realized that it had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but yeah. So duck migration, to anybody that hunts ducks and likes ducks, the migration is the part of the year they look forward to. And generally speaking, there was probably more consistency to it prior to the changes we've seen, especially over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of climate. And when I talk to people about climate change and they may be skeptical of it, I try to explain to them, like, we can argue the cause if you want, but it's not warming per se, it's the variability. And animals in general struggle with variability just like we do, variability in the weather. And so if I've had my club in Arkansas that throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s, I could mark the calendar about when the birds are going to arrive, and now that starts to change, well, I get unhappy. Like with turkeys eating other game and these types of things, I feel like people tend to look for the simplest answer and the ones that they think might be most manageable or easier to blame, or something that we could stop. Like, well, people have started heating ponds or putting out a lot of bait, things like that. But in the meantime, as I think we know, and I think people that are students of the game know, it's usually a lot more complex than that. And the landscape up here has changed dramatically. I did a master's degree up here in South Dakota from 97 to 2000. And when I was here, there was a lot less corn. There was a lot more small grains, a lot more pasture lands. And now it's a biculture. It's corn and soybean rotation almost entirely. And if we think about a duck like the mallard, which is, probably most important to everybody down there. Not me. I'll shoot gadwall all day long, but and be grateful for it. But, really what we've done throughout much of the country and up through the Midwest, especially the last 2 decades, as varieties has improved and yields have increased and more marginal lands are productive and can pencil out, can pay the note. We've taken the old food, the acorn, and just cut the A off the front. That's kind of what it is now. And
I'm stealing that. Oh my God, that's awesome.
Yeah.
If you think about it, when you add to that warmer temperatures up north, longer falls. I mean, again, when I was here around 2000 or so, by Thanksgiving we were going to probably be done. We couldn't use all of our hunting season because we were going to be freezing up. We were really lucky if we got a little bit more after that. And now I've been here for 13 years now since I came back in 2011, I think it was. And every season I've been here, you can pretty much hunt to the end, which is in mid-December approximately. And that was never true before. So it's at least a couple of weeks. And anyway, if you think about a mallard, right, and how they've evolved in the springtime, they're trying to get north as quick as they can and in the best condition they can. And those that nest first tend to have higher nest survival, tend to be more productive. So the higher north I can winter, just as an ecological strategy, that's better for me. And so if I can hang out in, a municipal pond in Bloomington, Illinois, that just puts me hundreds of miles closer to my breeding ground. And so it's really no wonder if I have a infinite food source like waste corn and open water. So, that happens. But in terms of like manipulating it, I think they give people a way too much credit to do something like that on that scale. You see the same thing with predator control, being a way to produce more ducks. And obviously that's been a hot topic, and Delta waterfowl has studied it immensely. But we know after doing that for many years that while in certain circumstances it might work, it's really not sustainable. It's an annual input. It's not really great ecologically in general. And, one of the, just like turkeys can get blamed for things, up here, there's a lot of blame goes to the coyote, maybe down there too. Well,
certainly.
Coyotes are kind of the duck and pheasant hunter's best friend up here, really. Coyote populations have increased dramatically, and they'll eat a duck nest if they find one, but they don't actively hunt them. But what they do is they kill red foxes, the red fox, which we hardly have any anymore. I haven't seen one in 5 years, probably. They kill feral cats. They kill all kinds of things. And we just got done with a study where we had 2 counties in adjacent counties in South Dakota, very highly productive for nesting ducks. If anybody's seen a thunderstorm map of breeding duck densities, this is the red area where you're talking, I'm trying to remember, maybe 100 per square mile or something like that. And the counties are identical. But in one county, they've had annual aerial gunning of coyotes, mainly to protect livestock. And it's serious. Like, they'll remove 200 to 600 or 700 coyotes out of this county every year. And then the adjacent county has not had any history of that. So it was kind of a nice natural experiment. And surprisingly enough, what we found was the county where there has not been consistent coyote removal had higher nest survival. Now, the heart of this ecologically is what they would call the mesopredator release hypothesis, or when you take out the top carnivores, all the other ones are released from the ecological downward pressure. And now we have more raccoons, skunks, and things that do actively target duck and pheasant nests and so forth. So it's not terribly surprising, but it was nice to actually be able to study it and see that it actually seemed to function the way that we think that it might.
Stafford, you said 2 really cool things there. The coyote thing.
I doubt it.
The coyote thing for sure. It's the same in the quail world, right? We love to blame the coyote down here because it's a novel predator in some of the deep eastern parts of the range. People use that term. Again, population skyrocketed based on land use practices. But as a quail biologist, same thing. They're eating a lot of the things that eat quail nest, and most of the research on coyotes with quail, because it was on my list to talk about today too. I think the most ever recovered in a stomach content analysis was 2% was bobwhite, and that was really rare. They're rarely a nest predator, although if they stumble upon one. But you're right, they won't tolerate foxes in their range, and foxes are a much more efficient nest predator for a bobwhite. So yeah, we don't promote them, but we also don't. I wouldn't call them a friend of the bobwhite, but I certainly don't advocate removal of them on a property that's purely bobwhite focused, because I don't really have a lot of reason to, and I've got some anecdotal evidence that maybe I should just kind of let it be. The other thing you mentioned really cool about predator management is, going back to what's happening in the prairies, is a lot of management practices work at a certain scale, but they're unscalable, right? I mean,
in space.
Exactly. Predator trapping, I remember all that research, and I remember all that stuff coming out, and I remember when Piron's research came out and what happened when there was a ton of grass, when there was 32 million acres of CRP in the country and adequate rainfall, and it kind of didn't hold up in that landscape in those conditions, which leads me to believe it's more of a habitat issue than a predator issue. But even if it does work on some areas, you can't just scale up every management practice in time or space, as you said, and it's just not scalable. So, I mean, are we ever going to trap every acre of the prairies? I doubt it.
Well, I mean, it's a competing interest thing, right? In a world of infinite resources, then maybe we would try to do something like that. Although there's social reasons why that might not go over well too. But it's not. Every dollar we want to spend on something like that is potentially a dollar taken away from some type of habitat program, which is the template for ecological strategies, is the thing that drives everything, really. A few years back, we did what I think is a super cool study. North Dakota Game and Fish and South Dakota Department of Game Fish Parks, through the dollars that the people watching or listening to this podcast put in through the excise tax on firearms, ammunition, things like that, Pittman-Robertson funds, largely paid for this study where we put GPS, GSM, I can explain that a little bit more here in a second, transmitters on juvenile birds. But usually when we've done studies in the past, like almost across the board, we're marking adult birds for a variety of reasons. You know, they're the ones that are probably going to produce the most nests, and they're heavier so they can take a transmitter a little bit better and so forth. But really, a lot of us, I mean, we don't even know about migration movements in our own states. And there's definitely a perception up here that you'll see lots and lots of mallards around before the season starts. And then about the time season comes around, they seem to disappear. So that was one of the reasons that they wanted to do this, to see, well, is there like a big movement up into Canada or anything? Or is it just perception? Or what's going on there? And then, of course, then we get all the data after that from these birds as they make their migration southward. And one thing we did that I'm a big believer in, I definitely think transmitters of any kind on a bird can have an adverse effect, and one that's really hard to measure. So you often don't know what birds are doing right and what birds might be adversely affected. And most of them are put on like a backpack or some type of external thing. So we wanted to try to do a little bit better than that. And we used an internal implants inside the abdomen of the bird. So we hired a vet to do the surgeries, and then then you poke a little hole in the back and it'd have an external antenna. But once they healed up, there really wasn't much obtrusive for the bird once they were healed. We had really great luck with these. And so the GPS part, everybody should know what that is. It's taking a location for the bird periodically of maybe 3-meter resolution, pretty good. But then the GSM part is the cellular phone system. And so it would upload these data through the phone system periodically. It's basically a text message, I think is what it really is. And so we marked a bunch of these birds. I'd have to actually double check the sample size, 140 or something, over a couple of years. And what we had, incidentally, was 2 very different autumn and winters. So as you can see from this figure here in 2018-19, this was a pretty warm winter. And you can see the majority of our birds ended up spending time in Kansas and into Oklahoma. Obviously, some made it to Arkansas and down into North Texas and stuff, but the wintering latitude was higher. And I think probably duck hunters might remember that year and be able to think, yeah, maybe the birds didn't show up as early or not at all. And this whole area of Kansas and Oklahoma, you know, you read about it in magazines as being kind of more recent duck hotspots and things like that. And, you know, it's not heated ponds per se or people pouring corn to them. It's just the fact that they could winter that far north. And for whatever reason, there's the resources in this area that maybe they would have been small grains or something less amenable to mallards. And then in the much harsher winter, you can see that we shift south and east. And I mean, they're even getting into Mississippi that year. And I know that you guys probably harvest a lot of mid-continent mallards and things as well. But for prairie mallards, that's just a great example of 2 very different winters and what you're going to get when you happen to have a mild winter. And unfortunately, there's really nobody to blame. You can blame me, people do, but it's just the variability of the system that we now live in, and you don't know what you're going to get from year to year. And I would ask the question based on the mild winter we had here, what was the hunting season like in, say, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana this year for you guys?
Not great.
Yeah, it wasn't outstanding by any stretch. It was better than last year. But that had a lot more than just milder temperatures to it. You know, we had drought all the way well north of us, and lots of other things that probably preventing any birds from moving south. But it was better than last year, but still not real great. But we had some mallards, and it wasn't awful, but it wasn't the best.
Stafford, you also said something pretty interesting there about people tend to pick the simplest. I'd like to amend that. My observation is there's a proportion of people that choose the simplest explanation. There's a slightly larger proportion that pick I'll say the sexiest explanation. The thing that seems the most cool to talk about around the water cooler, at the bar, whatever. Like, the DU heat and ponds things. I've told Calicut this. I was 16 when that came out, when I first heard it, and I had a bad duck season, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I was spreading that rumor, right? So in North Louisiana, it was rampant, and I was all about it. What else could it be, And so we were attracted to it because it blamed somebody that was a good, easy scapegoat, and it took the off the responsibilities off of somebody else did it, and somebody we like to get mad at. And that's why I think coyotes are the whipping child. I mean, they are the redheaded stepchild of the quail. Everything is the coyote's fault. Oh yeah, sorry.
Easy on the gender.
I'm not a stepchild, but I got the other part. At least I don't think I am. Although I do look like the mailman.
It's a common term.
Well,
anyway,
go ahead.
Thing that we love to blame somebody or something that's easy to blame, and it makes it sound. We all want to be a secret conspiracy theorist, and we love that stuff. And just get into it.
Human nature seems to be really fond of what you're saying, either the cool scapegoat or finding the silver bullet to something. Those two things seem to be what everybody jumps on.
Yeah, maybe simple answer actually wasn't the right term. Easy, maybe easier. And then you have groups that, can exploit these things too. And now with social media, it's even much easier for these things to take off. I wrote an essay for myself that I'm never going to put anywhere, but I call it like fast food management. It's the idea that, I can go to McDonald's, and unfortunately, I do go to McDonald's, and you can get full pretty quick on something pretty easy. But the real solution, just like a real nutritious meal or something, is a lot more complex potentially and a lot harder to actually solve. Something like climate change, we're just going to have to probably live with understanding that migration patterns are changed, and we might not get those things back. When we want to talk about things like nest survival, well, now that's something that, what appeals more to me? I can pay $5 and feel good about myself because I'm going to whack a skunk and I'm going to believe that I produce another nest, or I can put that money into something that's going to take years and years to show the improvements that we need. It's fixing the problem versus treating the symptom, maybe.
Yep. Yeah.
Preaching to the choir, I know.
No, it's a good topic, man. Like I said, I think Calicut, you tell me if you disagree, and of course the hunters we're around, the most of them, we're somewhat biased in who we hang out with, but I don't hear near as much. I mean, I think it's almost like, whether they'll call it climate change or not, but the weather patterns changing seems to be more broadly accepted amongst southern duck hunters, because I remember Robert Helm going around Louisiana and showing the snow line, and then showing the band return data back when I was in college. And I remember thinking, like, well, that's pretty obvious. And, even my father-in-law, he's a crop consultant, so he spends more time outside than I would argue just about anybody else on the planet. I mean, he is working in the field 6 days a week, daylight to dark, 9 months out of the year. And even he'll tell you, if the climate change, the people outside, it's very obvious, right, that there's these effects, right? So I think that one, we're getting better at that being the explanation. But of course, that hasn't stopped the flyway shifting discussion from which seems to be the new dominant one.
I mean, that's totally right. From my perspective too, I think there's a lot less resistance to, is this happening or not? I mean, you really have to have some cognitive bias to not believe that the climate has become more variable at the very least. Mm-hmm. What to do about it? Much harder system. So we try to focus on the same thing everybody tries to focus on, which is making sure that we do everything we can to have harvestable populations of ducks, and then what they do from there is up to Jobu. It's up to God. If you know that, if you know,
Major League too, man. that was great.
help me now, Jobu. Anyway,
You don't finish that line yet.
well, I don't want to neglect the upland side of things. So
Yeah.
All right, guys.
I
Want
wanna
to
hear-
hear a turkey one, or we can do quail ones.
I want to hear Dave's stories.
2 quick fun facts, then I'm going to kick you a quail question. One fun fact, Calicut, where'd the turkey get its name? What's that name all about?
I don't.
So it's a North American bird, right? And so when the Europeans came, they found this thing for the first time. They'd never seen this creature, and they thought about guinea fowl, African guinea fowl, that had in the Middle Ages basically made it to turkey. And so they considered it like a turkey bird, a turkey fowl, and so it was named turkey after that. And then one kind of quasi myth is, everybody else says that Ben Franklin voted for the wild turkey to be the national bird.
Mhm.
That's actually based on a little bit of fact, but it's not entirely true. The fact is that he very much disliked bald eagles. He thought that was a bad decision. And so I copied a little segment from the letter that this is all taken from. For my part, I wish the bald eagle had not been chosen as the representative of our country. He is a bird of bad moral character. But he goes on in that letter to say that the figure that they had made of the bald eagle looked nothing like a bald eagle, and he liked that because he hated bald eagles. In truth, it looks more like a turkey, which is a more respectable bird in a true origin in North America. Anyway, he liked turkeys a lot better than he liked bald eagles, and from there the myth spurred. So my question to McConnell, tell us about Mexican quail. What is the deal with Mexican quail?
What about them?
Well, the whole business of Mexican quail, I'm told that, they used to be enormous. Bob whites in our part of the world used to be able to stand flat-footed and breed chickens. I mean, they were giant birds. And now they're these small, little tiny birds that fly 1.25 miles and land up in the tops of trees and whatever. But back in the day, that wasn't the case. Prior to the Mexican bird invasion, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, Godwin, that wasn't one even on my list because I've forgotten so much about that one.
You're talking about you're not talking about like Montezuma quail or so. You're talking about bob whites.
Bob whites, yeah.
Okay.
And so the myth is that Mexican quail were released across the Southeast in such a scale that, number one, it shrunk. The old native bob white was an enormous bird.
Oh.
It was gigantic. And it only
Well, they
flew
gotta get ice on
a few paces. It flew 2 or 3 chains and went back down to get shot at again, kind of thing. It was a sporting bird, and the bird that was created after this infusion of Mexican quail blood was just a rascal of a thing. Exponentially smaller, faster, flew ungodly distances, used covers that could never be used by these native birds. Just a terrible situation.
How did they know? Did they have little sombreros or?
So the reality is, some number of birds have been stocked from different places, right? And so
course.
that, as soon as you get a bird from anywhere in the Southwest that's stocked in here, then all of a sudden that becomes the thing. So northern, there is a kind of a grade on size, right? But as far as the northern birds being a little larger than the very southern birds, but the scale that we're talking about is a reasonable scale, not this business of these things that were bigger than Cornish hens back in the day, giant birds.
There was also some rumors back in the day that the old bob white, before all this, the bottomland bob white was different than the upland bob white, because you could find bob whites down in the bottoms, and they were a little bit darker. And there was a lot of talk about the bottomland bob white being a little darker, maybe a little bigger. So a lot of stuff like that. Godwin, I've forgotten about the rumors about the Mexican quail. And of course, you hear a bunch of the restocking folks, the pen raised folks. They breed them enormous. And I've heard, even if you ever see a pen raised bird, they're pretty big. They're a lot bigger than a wild bob white. And they got the Texas Reds and all this other stuff in them. And I've even heard some people make the argument, well, that's how quail used to be. It's like, oh, okay, well. I had some in my aviary that we imprinted the chicks, and some of the chicks didn't imprint. We just raised them, and they were 250 grams. They were enormous. So that does happen. Going back to the letter, Godwin, that you mentioned from Ben Franklin, Lake Grisham had me read that several years ago when he was trapping turkeys for his master's degree at LSU. He just devours the bald eagle. You never look at a bald eagle the same way once you've read that essay.
Yeah,
it is
didn't
brutal.
think too much of a bald eagle anyway.
It was brutal.
Why don't you give us a couple of your Bob White ones real quick if we have time, James?
Yep.
Yeah, well, there's some older ones and then there's some newer ones. The easy ones are, fire ants are the cause. That one's still been around, and it's there's a little truth. Fire ants, red imported fire ants, they're definitely not good for quail, but they're certainly not the cause of the decline. They
Okay.
have minuscule.
I really didn't know that. I remember being absolutely amazed when I moved to Mississippi at like the densities of fire ant mounds and just how ubiquitous they were. And I admit it's like, where would they go that they wouldn't be harassed by these things? It's interesting to hear that it's not a significant issue.
Yeah, so there were red imported fire ants, Solenopsis invicta. They're worse than our native fire ants in terms of they're more aggressive. They have, much bigger foraging radiuses and stuff like that. So they're certainly not a good thing for quail. If we could go back and get rid of them, certainly we would. But in areas where you have some of the highest quail densities in the country, there's a fire ant mound every 20 meters.
Oh God, yeah.
You go burn in the Red Hills where they're pushing 2 birds per acre some years, there's fire ant mounds everywhere. So they will eat a net, recently hatched chicks, certainly, but they're definitely not causing the impact that they've been given credit for. And you can actually put out certain chemicals to knock them back. It'll knock them back quite dramatically. There actually is research that shows you can actually increase nest success a little bit. But the crazy part is, and I'm sure maybe similar to the duck situation, nest success really isn't the demographic rate that drives quail populations. There's an operational range of nest success that quail kind of fluctuate in that isn't, the population growth really isn't that sensitive to nest success. It's sensitive to overwinter survival, brood survival, those kinds of things. So, if you increase nest success by, 4 or 5% through getting rid of fire ants, it's great. Doesn't necessarily mean your fall population is going to be 5% higher. And that's the kind of the misnomer there. But certainly they're not good. I wish they weren't there. But there's plenty of other things eating quail nests that fire ants are not the leading factor by any stretch of the imagination. That's kind of an old one we hear about a lot. The new one is the eyeworm thing. That's kind of taken over the social media world with this eyeworms and cecal worms, that these parasites that are, according to some people, limiting populations across the range. And there's really no data to support that. There's some data from the Rolling Plains region of Texas that have really high parasite loads, and they do have a chemical approved product, an FDA approved, USDA, whoever administers it, approved product that you can put out through a specialized feeder, and it's just medicated feed, and it will absolutely reduce the parasite load. Like, it's been very well demonstrated. What they haven't demonstrated is that a certain parasite load actually negatively impacts quail populations. In fact, there's data to show that really high parasite loads don't seem to have much of an impact on reproduction. Keep in mind, a quail only has to live long enough to breed, pretty much, and raise broods. They don't live that long anyway. So, they've documented eyeworms and sharp tails back in the 50s, quail back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, they've been documented all over the place. There is an elevated parasite load in this region of Texas for whatever reason, but there's no evidence whatsoever that it's affecting quail range wide or that it's negatively impacting quail in those areas. So that's kind of the newest one we've been dealing with. Now, I'll be the first one, when the data demonstrates otherwise, I'll be the first one to come and say, hey, the situation has changed. But as of now, that I wouldn't call that a myth. I would call that a misunderstanding of the data. And I think a lot of this could be chalked up to just sometimes honest and sometimes maybe not misunderstandings of what the data says. And y'all mentioned social media. In the quail world, this is our first, what I'm going to call a red herring. This is our first red herring in the social media age. All the other stuff we've talked about with quail has been several decades in the making, right? This is our first one that's new, and it's in the social media age. So fighting it and fighting disinformation and misinformation, it's just a whole new ballgame now that our profession's really not equipped for. We don't have any training in marketing, but that seems to be what's getting the message around, is getting on a podcast and saying something and then not having a whole lot of people to refute it.
Yeah, that's kind of, we joke, Bronson and I talk a lot about how that's becoming an extension specialist job, is fighting misinformation as much as it is putting out good information about wildlife and habitat management and such.
I think about, I'll be real quick, what you're saying in the duck world too, and I find, unfortunately, it becomes a distraction from things that really are going on that we should pay attention to. For example, sex ratios in ducks and almost all species have been declining for some time, skewed more to males than females, and we don't know why. and we're having a very hard time figuring out the mechanism, or the consequences, if there are any, really. But it's weird. And avian flu is becoming more of a bigger issue. It's killing a lot of snow geese recently, but we don't know exactly how that's going to affect things. And then we have, of course, lately the hot topic's been genetics and these game farm mallards. And I personally think that's a red herring on our side, but that's probably a topic for another time. So you never know where it's going to go.
Yeah, and with the speaking of the sex ratios and stuff, some of the things that we might do to experiment with that too kind of are right there with a lot of what some of the information that or things that people are really talking about. So if you listen to a lot of podcasts or folks in the Southeast especially, there's a lot of we're killing too many ducks, and and the whole AHM is BS and all that sort of stuff going on. And with skewed sex ratios, one thing of experimentation with that could be shoot more drakes, and things, things that are on the table that flyways and such might be talking about at some point. And that's kind of real rough world to have the time where your constituency thinks that we're shooting too many, and then the response be, hey, y'all should shoot more mallards, drake mallards.
We almost can't shoot enough ducks, honestly.
Yeah. I don't think we're shooting too many, guys. I know
that's a topic for another podcast.
Yes, it certainly is. But I
hope we get to do this again.
Let's
invite me back.
Let's do that one, but get somebody who thinks we are versus somebody who thinks we're not, and let's let them duke it out. That'd be fun.
Well, I don't think we let Dave tell his last story that he had.
Yeah, I've got some other stuff. One of the misconceptions on wild turkeys is the range. So as a kid, I was a wild turkey hunter, and while they're henned up in the spring of the year, like right now, they're not that terribly mobile usually, but across the annual cycle, really mobile. And so a lot of telemetry studies that would indicate, 6 square miles is a good average home range for a wild turkey gobbler. And so growing up as a turkey hunter, if you told me that, I was like, no, there's just absolutely no way. They are a very mobile bird. And so as such, landowners, very few of us manage, 6 square miles or 12 square miles, but you can do a lot of things on a relatively small piece of property to make those properties more attractive to wild turkeys in the spring. And you certainly work with, hunters and hunt club cooperatives and neighbors to manage habitat in a way to affect the population anyway. But that's one misconception, is just the range of the birds. They're a lot more mobile.
Godwin, that brings up a lot of issues with, you hear a lot of turkey hunters that they a lot of assumptions about smaller home ranges. They probably didn't have a number in their head, but probably smaller, thinking they're hunting the same gobbler. Well, I know he roosts up there.
Yeah.
Thinking that gobblers are using the same roost tree over and over again. And I think Chamberlain just had a paper come out that showed that, every now and then, but they're using a lot of different, other gobblers may use that roost area, but there's a lot of folks that assume if they go back a couple mornings in a row, that gobbler's that same gobbler, and that I'm hunting that gobbler. And yeah. I think the you combine what Chamberlain showed about roost site selection with their enormous home range, and it's like, like you said, it's not 6 square miles during the breeding season, but it's also not 20 acres during the breeding season.
Their ranges get a little restricted while they are with hens and all that. Brood ranges are a little more restricted, but seasonal ranges and annual home ranges pretty impressive anyway. Talking about a bird that's really mobile, certainly more so than I realized before I started tracking them around with radio telemetry equipment.
Yeah, and Dave, I think that goes to a lot of the phone calls and such we get a lot of times, like, well, I used to have turkeys, and now all of a sudden, I don't have as many as I used to, and nothing's changed on my property. I'm still doing the same thing. And we talk about this in a lot of contexts with other things, but it's one of those I think bears reiterating a lot on here, is just that landscape change, since their range is so wide, and there's a lot of things, they're using more than just your property, between fall and winter ranges. Some big change outside your property could disrupt that, and maybe you're not in that as much in that range anymore or something, somebody got some timber in between nearby that they were maybe using as fall, and maybe now they don't have that, and so you're not there as close in there to be in their spring range anymore, or what have you,
No doubt. When I do technical guidance to private landowners, the first thing I like to do is look back at the 30,000 foot level for wild turkeys and see what the context is, and then try to, we've got really good opportunity to get really good aerial photography for the last several years. and look how those things have changed or whatever. You have some really good habitat in a bad context and not have a lot of wild turkeys. And you can have some pretty marginal habitat in a really good context and have pretty good turkey hunting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest ones. I think we probably all, across all these species, are fighting, like you said, Calicut, nothing's changed. Well, first of all, yeah, it has. Even if it hasn't on your property, which a lot of people will say it hasn't, when it has, the landscape has changed dramatically. I've heard people say, well, the Delta's been the same this way. Well, the Delta has changed in Mississippi since I've been in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. There was more water in the winter and less tilled up dirt come duck season when I got here in 08 than there is now. Now everything is tilled up almost within weeks of harvest, and there's less water on the landscape. Just from my observation, I can't prove that with any data, but man, it is obvious. I had a guy in Georgia when I was at UGA.
Well, now be careful. You sound like the other people that say it's obvious. When it's obvious the quail are getting eaten by the turkeys.
Yeah, just out of your car window driving to your in-laws for Christmas.
But I understand exactly what you mean.
Travels across the Delta in the last 15 years, it is a lot less water. There was a landowner in Georgia when I was there, and he listened to me talk for 30 or something minutes at an extension talk about quail management, whatever. Then at the end of it, he comes up and he says, hey, my place, nothing's changed, but them damn coyotes. And I said, okay, so you're seeing more coyotes. He goes, yeah. And then in the conversation, he starts explaining all the changes to his landscape over the last 40 years that he just said didn't happen. And then at the end of it, he goes, well, I guess I did change a few things, but the coyotes. And it's like, I can't explain this to this person. It's pointless.
One time I gave a talk to a waterfowlers group about moist soil management and natural plant seeds and their value, essential amino acids, the whole 9 yards. And I got done. The first question I had was, what do you think about buckwheat? And I said, well, he was like my second favorite little rascal, but it was just totally dead. Not one smile, not one chuckle. I thought I had some good game there, but it just goes to show you, you can do your best in some scenarios to try to explain best management practice or this or that. And if somebody has something else in their head, it's really hard to get around.
Mark, I thought you were going to say that guy came up to you and told you that he had never learned so little from so many words in his life. But,
Did that happen to one of y'all?
No.
No.
Yeah.
It's just the general feeling I have when Mark and I talk.
No, it has been very interesting to see what people are willing to listen to and what they're not. And the longer they hold a view, it seems the harder it is to break them apart from. And we're all probably guilty of that.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't want to pick on landowners or our audiences. In the game bird world, the good thing about the DU conspiracy, granted, maybe it started well before I was a teenager, but it seemed to catch on then. The good thing is it didn't seem to stick around as long as some other conspiracy theories did. It seemed to have, we're still fighting the turkey thing with quail, but I don't hear many people talking about DU heating ponds anymore. Although, Calicut, I just told you a story about somebody who told me that last weekend, but that's the first time I've heard it in a while.
And my perception is a lot of that came around from about the time Missouri passed their conservation sales tax, and they had some really great lands and put a whole lot of effort into it, and they were wintering more birds than they were in the past. Mm-hmm. But instead of thinking about the fact that, gosh, how about a sales tax? How about conservation? How about doing some of this? It went totally the other way.
Yeah. It's funny how that works like that, but kind of probably like along the lines of the turkey thing. Like, well, turkey populations increase and quail go down. Just seems like an easy explanation. But
yeah.
Well, fellas, I think it's been an amazing conversation, and I think also it's probably given us about 4 more podcast topic ideas that we should come back, get the band back together here and tackle, duck harvest and sex ratios and all those things. I think we could have talked about for 2 hours. And plenty of stuff, I'm sure, on the quail and turkey side, too. We can do some more conversations, get y'all back. But I appreciate y'all taking the time to visit with us today. And it was a good conversation, fellas.
Thank you, guys. And Dave, I'm sorry if I hogged a bunch of the time. I anytime I get a captive audience who wants to hear about ducks, it's a little tough to shut me up.
It's pretty standard with the duck people around here.
Yeah, that's understandable. Nobody else listens, so we take the opportunities that we can. Yeah, I'd love to do it again.
We do love a soapbox. So, all right. Well, thank you, fellas.
All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on Game Bird University podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_GameBird or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Game Bird Program.